In January 2025, a drilling team in East Antarctica pulled something out of the ice that shouldn't exist, at least not if everything you've been told online were true. After 4 years of drilling nearly 3 kilometers into the frozen surface, they extracted a core filled with tiny air bubbles, perfectly preserved, untouched, each one a microscopic time capsule. And when scientists analyzed those bubbles, they didn't find traces of some recent catastrophe. They found something far stranger: air from over 1,000,000 years ago. Not estimated, not guessed, measured, verified. Frozen breath from a world that existed long before humans ever walked the earth. That single discovery quietly destroys one of the internet's most viral ideas, that Antarctica was recently ice-free and suddenly frozen in some forgotten disaster. Because you can't trap million-year-old air inside ice that formed just a few centuries ago. The physics doesn't allow it. The chemistry doesn't allow it. Reality doesn't allow it. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because if that theory falls apart, something else takes its place. And what replaces it is not less disturbing, it's more. You've probably seen the videos, the ones that claim Antarctica wasn't always frozen, that ancient maps prove it, that a lost civilization once thrived there, buried beneath the ice after some sudden global event. Maybe you've heard the name Tartaria. Maybe you've seen overlays of old maps supposedly matching the Antarctic coastline. And maybe, for a moment, it felt convincing. The idea that something massive was hidden from you, something world-changing. And here's the truth. That feeling is not an accident. Because the real story of Antarctica does involve secrecy. It does involve missing records. It does involve entire chapters of history that were never properly told. Just not in the way those videos claim. Let's start with the maps, because that's where the myth begins. One of the most famous is the Peary Race map from 1513, often presented as proof that Antarctica was known centuries before its official discovery. At first glance, it's compelling. The southern edge of the map appears to show a landmass that some claim matches Antarctica. But there's a detail almost no one mentions: a note written directly on the map itself. The mapmaker describes that southern land as hot, not cold, not frozen, hot. He mentions ruins, large snakes, conditions so hostile that sailors avoided landing there. That is not Antarctica, not even close. Historians who studied the map in detail found something far less mysterious and far more human. The coastline is a distorted version of South America, specifically Patagonia, warped by the limitations of early cartography. It looks strange because early mapmakers were trying to fit incomplete knowledge onto imperfect surfaces. They weren't hiding secrets, they were guessing. The same pattern repeats with another commonly cited map from 1531. It shows a massive southern continent detailed with rivers and coastlines, often claimed to be Antarctica before it froze. But the man who created that map labeled it clearly Terra Australis, a hypothetical landmass that scholars believed had to exist to balance the continents in the north. It wasn't a discovery, it was a theory, a placeholder for the unknown. So, if the maps don't prove a hidden civilization, why does the idea feel so convincing? Because it's built on something real. Not an ancient empire, not a global catastrophe, but a gap in history that no one ever fully explained. Officially, Antarctica wasn't discovered until 1820, which sounds strange when you think about it. A continent larger than Europe, untouched and unseen until the 19th century? That doesn't feel right. It feels incomplete. And that feeling that something is missing is exactly what conspiracy theories latch onto. But the missing piece isn't what you think. Because long before Antarctica was discovered, people were already there. Not scientists, not explorers, hunters. Starting in the late 1700s, ships from Britain, America, and Europe began pushing further south in search of fur seals. At the time, seal fur was incredibly valuable. There was massive demand, especially in China, where new techniques made the pelt softer and more desirable. And where there's demand, there's exploitation. The pattern was brutal and efficient. A new island would be found rich with seals. Ships would arrive in waves. Thousands of animals would be slaughtered in a matter of weeks. Then, when the population collapsed, the hunters would move on, further south, deeper into unknown waters, chasing the next untouched colony. This wasn't exploration, it was extraction. By the early 1800s, the Southern Ocean had become an industrial killing zone. Entire seal populations were wiped out in decades, millions of animals reduced to oil and fur. Beaches covered in carcasses, the scale was staggering. And here's the part no one talks about. These hunters didn't share information. They couldn't. Their profits depended on secrecy. If another ship discovered your hunting grounds, the seals would be gone before you returned. So routes were hidden, maps were kept private. Knowledge of the southern regions existed, but it was fragmented, scattered across logbooks and memories that never entered official history. In other words, Antarctica wasn't unknown, it was undocumented. By the time multiple nations officially discovered the continent in 1820, hundreds of ships had already been operating in those waters for decades. They just weren't telling anyone where they'd been. And suddenly, that gap in history starts to make sense. It wasn't a cover-up of ancient civilizations, it was a side effect of profit-driven secrecy, a silent industry that erased its own tracks to survive. But the story doesn't end there, because even after Antarctica entered the official record, the pattern of hidden motives continued. In 1946, just after World War II, the United States launched one of the largest expeditions in Antarctic history. 13 ships, dozens of aircraft, thousands of personnel. It was called Operation High Jump, and if you've spent any time online, you've probably heard the theories. Secret bases, lost technology, hidden structures beneath the ice. The reality is less fantastical, but not exactly comforting. The operation's true purpose wasn't exploration, it was strategy. The world had just entered the nuclear age. Military planners were thinking in terms of global reach, polar routes, and territorial control. Antarctica wasn't just a frozen wasteland, it was a potential asset, a place where power could be projected, claims could be made, and influence could be extended. Operation High Jump was a show of force, a demonstration that the United States could operate in extreme conditions, that it could reach the most remote place on Earth and establish a presence there. It was about positioning, and it didn't go smoothly. Most of the personnel had no experience in polar environments. Equipment failed. Conditions were harsher than expected. The mission ended earlier than planned, and much of the data collected was incomplete or unusable. Not a secret war, not a hidden discovery, just a massive, imperfect attempt to assert control in a place no one fully understood. Then came 1959. 7 countries had made overlapping claims on Antarctica. Tensions were rising. There were confrontations, even gunfire. The Cold War was escalating, and the last thing the world needed was another conflict, this time on ice. So something unusual happened. Nations that didn't trust each other agreed. The Antarctic Treaty was signed, freezing territorial claims and banning military activity on the continent. No weapons, no nuclear tests, no new claims of ownership, only scientific research. To some, that agreement feels suspicious. Why would so many countries cooperate unless they were hiding something? But the answer is simpler and more human, because the alternative was conflict. Antarctica wasn't sealed to protect a secret, it was stabilized to prevent a war. And today, despite what you might hear, the continent isn't off limits. Thousands of people visit every year. Tourists, researchers, support crews. You can book a trip if you have the money. It's difficult, expensive, logistically complex, but it's not forbidden. So if Antarctica isn't hiding a lost civilization, if the maps don't prove ancient knowledge, if the ice itself tells a story millions of years old, then what is really being hidden? Not a place, a history. Because the discovery of Antarctica wasn't a heroic journey into the unknown. It was the byproduct of an ecological collapse, a rush driven by profit, a silent race that left millions of dead animals in its wake and almost no official record behind. That story doesn't get told often. It's not exciting in the way conspiracy theories are. It doesn't offer a secret world waiting to be uncovered. It offers something less comfortable, a reflection of how human systems actually work, quietly, efficiently, often destructively. And that's harder to package. But there's one more layer, because while the conspiracy theories are wrong about what's under the ice, they're not wrong about one thing. There are still mysteries down there. Beneath kilometers of ice lie lakes that have been sealed off for millions of years, entire ecosystems that have never seen sunlight, geological formations we've barely begun to map, signals we don't fully understand yet. Not evidence of a lost civilization, but evidence that we are still at the beginning of understanding this place. And maybe that's the real reason Antarctica feels so strange to us. Not because it was hidden, but because it still is. Not by governments or treaties, but by its own nature, its scale, its isolation, its resistance to being known. The difference between a conspiracy and a mystery is simple. A conspiracy tells you the answer before you ask the question. A mystery invites you to keep looking. And Antarctica is still a mystery. So the next time you see a video claiming the truth has been hidden from you, ask yourself something simple. Is this giving you answers or taking them away? Because the real story doesn't need ancient maps or buried empires to be extraordinary. It already is. And we've only just started to read it.